So the European Union is in something of a crisis at the moment. The crisis comes not from the failure of European politicians to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, but rather from the contradiction between responses at the national level and responses at the European level. And that contradiction emerges pretty frequently in the context of European integration. But this time it seems to be particularly important. We can see the significance of it both in terms of the struggle to create some kind of mutualized debt obligation, as the countries of Southern Europe argue that they're badly positioned to respond to the crisis in fiscal terms, and yet the crisis is affecting them more powerfully than it's affecting other parts of Europe, and so they need support in many ways in order to get access to the resources necessary to stabilize and then rebuild their economies. Whereas the Northern European countries are responding, well, you should have gotten your house in order first. And we have to focus, we Northern Europeans, on taking advantage of the opportunities we created for ourselves in consolidating our fiscal performance after the last crisis. So rather than create incentives for Southern European countries not to respond effectively after this crisis, the Northern Europeans are looking for ways to ensure not only that Europe gets through this crisis, but also that it prepares itself more adequately for the next. There's certainly a logic to that argument, but the logic to that argument creates, nevertheless, an important tension in the context of European integration writ large. Another example of this tension lies in the functioning of the European Central Bank, because the European Central Bank is the institution that becomes responsible in many respects for filling up the gap that emerges when national responses, particularly national fiscal responses, prove to be inadequate. And when the European Central Bank grows to fill that gap, as it has done in successive decisions on March the 12th and March the 18th, when the European Central Bank expands to fill that gap, it necessarily takes on responsibilities that look to some as if they go beyond what is the mandate of a European institution and begin to replace what should be political decisions at the national level. Now, the assumption would be that these are new kinds of tensions that are brought on by an unprecedented crisis. But in fact, you could go back through the history of European integration, and every time there is a crisis like this, these sorts of tensions emerge. And what these tensions reveal is that European integration and European disintegration often, and I would suggest almost always, coexist. That we need to understand the tensions at the heart of the European project if we're going to make sure that that European project is successful looking ahead to the future. It's not enough simply to imagine that future or to embrace the Europe that people might aspire to see come into being. It's also necessary to take into consideration all those many voices that see in this Europe more problems than solutions, to bring those voices on board and to ensure that they get a fair hearing. Not because we have necessarily to agree with what they have to say, but because if we don't pay attention to what those people who experience European disintegration are going through, then we shouldn't be surprised if they lose support for the European project as a whole.